Disorders of reading and writing. Reading and writing are closely related to listening and speaking or signing. Oral and written language abilities have many brain mechanisms in common. This module discusses the neural bases of reading and writing disorders. The reading and writing skills of people with aphasia almost always reflect their expression and comprehension abilities. For example, patients with Wernicke's aphasia have as much difficulty reading and writing as they do speaking and understanding language. Patients with Broca's aphasia comprehend what they read about as well as they understand spoken language, but their reading aloud is poor. If a patient's speech is agrammatical, so is their writing. If they have difficulty comprehending grammar when listening to speech, they also have difficulty when reading. Patients with conduction aphasia generally have some difficulty reading. When they read aloud, they often make semantic paraphasias, saying synonyms or related words for some of the words they read, just as they do when attempting to repeat what they hear. Depending on the location of the lesion, some patients with transcortical sensory aphasia may read aloud accurately but fail to comprehend what they read. Pure alexia. LO 14.11 identify the symptoms and biological basis of pure alexia. Desjarine, 1892, described a remarkable syndrome, which we now call pure alexia or sometimes pure word blindness or alexia without agraphia. His patient had a lesion in the visual cortex of the left occipital lobe and the posterior end of the corpus callosum. The patient could still write, although he had lost the ability to read. In fact, if he was shown some of his own writing, he could not read it. The case below illustrates the unique nature of pure alexia. This case involves a man with pure alexia who discovered his ability to write in an interesting way. A few months after he sustained a head injury that caused his brain damage, he and his wife were watching a service person repair their washing machine. The patient wanted to say something privately to his wife, so he picked up a pad of paper and jotted a note. As he was handing it to her, they suddenly realized with amazement that although he could not read, he was able to write. His wife brought the note to their neurologist, who asked the patient to read it. Although he remembered the general content of the message, he could not read the words he had written. Although patients with pure alexia cannot read, they can recognize words that are spelled aloud to them. This indicates they have not lost their memories of the spellings of words. Pure alexia is a perceptual disorder. It is similar to pure word deafness, except that the patient has difficulty with visual input, not auditory input. The disorder is caused by lesions that prevent visual information from reaching the visual association cortex of the left hemisphere, Damasio and Damasio, 1983, 1986, Molko et al., 2002. Figure 14.24 explains why Desjarine's original patient could not read. The left side of the diagram shows the pathway that visual information would take if a person had damage only to the left primary visual cortex. In this case, the person's right visual field would be blind. They would see nothing to the right of the fixation point. But people with this disorder can read. Their only problem is that they must look to the right of each word so that they can see all of it, which means that they read somewhat more slowly than someone with full vision. See figure 14.24a. Let's trace the flow of visual information for a person with this brain damage that enables that person to read words aloud. Information from the left side of the visual field is transmitted to the right striate cortex, primary visual cortex, and then to regions of right visual association cortex. From there, the information crosses the posterior corpus callosum and is transmitted to a region of the left visual association cortex known as the visual word form area, VW-FA, where it is analyzed further. The information is then transmitted to speech mechanisms located in the left frontal lobe, and the person can then read the words aloud. Look again at figure 14.24a. The right side of the diagram shows Desjarine's patient. Notice how the additional lesion of the corpus callosum prevents visual information concerning written text from reaching the VW-FA in the left hemisphere. Because this brain region is essential for the ability to recognize words, the patient cannot read. See figure 14.24b. Maudryer and Panich, 2004, reported the case of a man with multiple sclerosis who displayed the symptoms of pure alexia after sustaining a lesion that damaged both the subcortical white matter of the left occipital lobe and the posterior corpus callosum. As you can see in figure 14.25, the lesions are in the locations that Desjarine predicted would cause the syndrome, except that the white matter that serves the left primary visual cortex is damaged, not the cortex itself. The diagrams shown in figure 14.25 illustrate only the pathway involved in seeing a word and pronouncing it, and they ignore neural structures that would be involved in understanding its meaning. As we will see later in this chapter, evidence from patients with brain lesions indicates that seeing and pronouncing words can take place independently of understanding them. Although the diagrams are simplified, they are not unreasonable, given what we know about the neural components of the reading process. Writing is not the only form of visible language. People can also communicate by means of sign. Hickok and colleagues 1996 reported on a case of sign blindness caused by damage similar to that which causes pure alexia. The patient, a right-handed woman who was deaf, sustained a stroke that damaged her left occipital lobe and the posterior corpus callosum. The lesion did not impair her ability to sign in coherent sentences, but she could no longer understand other people's sign language, and she lost her ability to read. She had some ability to comprehend single signs, corresponding to single words, but she could not comprehend signed sentences. Toward an understanding of reading. LO 14.12 described the biological basis of acquired and developmental dyslexia. Reading involves at least two different processes: direct recognition of the word as a whole and sounding it out letter by letter. When we see a familiar word, we normally recognize it and pronounce it, a process known as whole word reading. With very long words, we might instead perceive segments of several letters each. The second method, which we use for unfamiliar words, requires recognition of individual letters and knowledge of the sounds they make. This process is known as phonetic reading. Evidence for our ability to sound out words is easy to obtain. In fact, you can prove to yourself that phonetic reading exists by trying to read the following words. Glab trisk chint. These are not really words, but most readers are able to pronounce them. Readers don't recognize them because they have probably never seen them before. Instead, readers use what they know about the sounds that are represented by particular letters or small groups of letters, such as CH, to figure out how to pronounce the words. Figure 14.26 illustrates some elements of the reading processes. The diagram is an oversimplification of a very complex process, but it helps to organize some of the facts that investigators have obtained. It considers only reading and pronouncing single words, not understanding the meaning of text. When we see a familiar word, we normally recognize it as a whole and pronounce it. If we see an unfamiliar word or a pronounceable non-word, we must try to read it phonetically. The best evidence that people can read words without sounding them out, using the whole word method, comes from studies of patients with acquired dyslexias. Dyslexia means faulty reading. Acquired dyslexias are caused by damage to the brains of people who already know how to read. In contrast, developmental dyslexias refer to reading difficulties that become apparent when children are learning to read. Researchers have reported several types of acquired dyslexias. 3 of them will be described here: surface dyslexia, direct dyslexia, and phonological dyslexia. Developmental dyslexias, which appear to involve anomalies in brain circuitry, are discussed in a later section. Surface dyslexia. Surface dyslexia is a deficit in whole word reading. The term surface reflects the fact that people with this disorder make errors related to the visual appearance of the words and to pronunciation rules, not to the meaning of the words, which is metaphorically deeper than the appearance. Because patients with surface dyslexia have difficulty recognizing words as a whole, they must sound them out. They can easily read words with regular spelling, such as hand, table, or chin. However, they have difficulty reading words with irregular spelling, such as so, pint, and yacht. In fact, they may read these words as sue, pint, and yachet. They have no difficulty reading pronounceable non-words, such as glab, trisk, and chint. Because people with surface dyslexia cannot recognize whole words by their appearance, they must, in effect, listen to their own pronunciation to understand what they are reading. If they read the word pint and pronounce it pint, they will say that it is not an English word, which it is not, pronounced that way. If the word is one member of a homophone, it will be impossible for them to understand it unless it is read in the context of a sentence. For example, if you hear the single word pear without additional information, you cannot know whether the speaker is referring to pear, or pear. See figure 14.27. Direct dyslexia. Direct dyslexia, as you read earlier in this chapter, recognizing a spoken word is different from understanding it. For example, patients with transcortical sensory aphasia can repeat what is said to them even though they show no signs of understanding what they hear or say. The same is true for reading. Direct dyslexia resembles transcortical sensory aphasia, except that the words in question are written, not spoken. Gerhand, 2001, Litton and Brust, 1989, Schwartz et al., 1979. Patients with direct dyslexia are able to read aloud even though they cannot understand the words they are saying. After sustaining a stroke that damaged his left frontal and temporal lobes, Litton and Brust, 1989, patient lost the ability to communicate verbally, his speech was meaningless, and he was unable to comprehend what other people said to him. However, he could read words with which he was already familiar. He could not read pronounceable non-words, therefore, he had lost the ability to read phonetically. His comprehension deficit seemed complete. When the investigators presented him with a word and several pictures, one of which corresponded to the word, he read the word correctly but had no idea what picture went with it. Gerhands, 2001, patient showed a similar pattern of deficits except that she was able to read phonetically. She could sound out pronounceable non-words. These findings indicate that the brain regions responsible for phonetic reading and whole word reading are each directly connected with brain regions responsible for speech. Phonological dyslexia. The symptoms of phonological dyslexia are opposite those of surface dyslexia. People with this disorder can read by the whole word method, but cannot sound out words. These individuals can read words that they are already familiar with but have great difficulty figuring out how to read unfamiliar words or pronounceable non-words. Beauvois and de Ruessen, 1979. De Ruessen and Beauvois, 1979. People with phonological dyslexia may be excellent readers if they had already acquired a good reading vocabulary before their brain damage occurred. Phonological dyslexia provides further evidence that whole word reading and phonological reading involve different brain mechanisms. Phonological reading, which is the only way we can read non-words or words we have not yet learned, entails some sort of letter-to-sound decoding. Phonological reading of English requires more than decoding of the sounds produced by single letters because, for example, some sounds are transcribed as two-letter sequences, such as th or sh, and the addition of the letter e to the end of a word lengthens an internal vowel, cam becomes came. See figure 14.28. The Japanese language provides a particularly interesting distinction between phonetic and whole word reading. The Japanese language makes use of two kinds of written symbols. Kanji symbols are pictographs, adopted from the Chinese language, although they are pronounced as Japanese words. Kanji represent concepts by means of visual symbols, but do not provide a guide to their pronunciation. Reading words expressed in kanji symbols is analogous, then, to whole word reading. Kana symbols are phonetic representations of syllables, and they encode acoustical information. These symbols are used primarily to represent foreign words or Japanese words that the average reader would be unlikely to recognize if they were represented by their kanji symbols. Reading words expressed in kana symbols is phonetic. See figure 14.29. Studies of people with localized brain damage that read both kana and kanji have shown that reading kana and kanji symbols involves different brain mechanisms. Iwata, 1984, Sakurai et al., 2001, Sakurai et al., 1994. Difficulty reading kanji symbols is a form of surface dyslexia, whereas difficulty reading kana symbols is a form of phonological dyslexia. What regions are involved in these two kinds of reading? Evidence from lesion and functional imaging studies with readers of English, Chinese, and Japanese suggest that the process of whole word reading follows the ventral stream of the visual system to a region, the fusiform gyrus, located on the base of the temporal lobe. For example, functional imaging studies by Liu and colleagues, 2008, and Tui and colleagues, 2004, found that reading kanji words or Chinese characters, whole word reading, activated the left fusiform gyrus, a region of the cerebral cortex located at the base of the temporal lobe. This region has come to be known as the visual word form area or VWF, Dehaene, 2009. Part of the fusiform gyrus is also involved in the perception of faces and other shapes that require expertise to distinguish, and recognizing whole words or kanji symbols requires expertise. The location of the neural circuitry responsible for phonological reading is less certain. Many investigators believe that it involves the region of the cerebral cortex that surrounds the junction of the inferior parietal lobe and the superior temporal lobe. The temporoparietal cortex, and then follows a fiber bundle from this region to the inferior frontal cortex, which includes Broca's area, Jobert et al., 2003, Sakurai et al., 2000, Tend et al., 2005, Tui et al., 2004. However, damage restricted to the cortex of the VWF without damage to underlying white matter produces pure alexia, Beversdorf et al., 1997. Although phonological reading may involve the temporoparietal cortex, the VWF appears to play an essential role in both forms of reading. The fact that phonological reading involves Broca's area suggests that it may actually involve articulation, that we sound out words not so much by hearing them in our heads as by feeling ourselves pronounce them silently to ourselves. As you read earlier in this chapter, feedback from the inferior frontal cortex plays a role in perception of spoken words. Once words have been identified, by either means, their meaning must be accessed, which means that the two pathways converge on regions of the brain involved in recognition of word meaning, grammatical structure, and semantics. See figure 14.30 and table 14.2. Visual word form area. The neural circuits involved in written and auditory information must also eventually converge, because both must have access to the same linguistic and semantic information that identify words and their meaning. An interesting study by Marinkovic and colleagues, 2003, used magnetoencephalography to trace regional brain activation as people heard or read individual words. The study showed that neural activation responsible for the analysis of a spoken word began in the auditory cortex of the temporal lobe and spread to the auditory association cortex on the superior temporal lobe, including Wernicke's area, and then to the inferior frontal cortex, including Broca's area. The neural activation responsible for the analysis of a printed word began in the visual cortex and spread to the base of the temporal lobe, including the VW-Phe in the fusiform gyrus, and then to the inferior frontal cortex. The temporoparietal cortex received little activation, presumably because the participants were fluent readers who did not need to sound out the common words they were asked to read. Let's consider the role of the VW-Phe. Some parts of the visual association cortex must be involved in perceiving written words. You will recall from Chapter 6 that visual agnosia is a perceptual deficit in which people with bilateral damage to the visual association cortex cannot recognize objects by sight. However, people with visual agnosia can still read, which means that the perceptual analysis of objects and words involves at least some different brain mechanisms. This fact is both interesting and puzzling. Certainly, the ability to read cannot have shaped the evolution of the human brain because the invention of writing is only a few thousand years old, and, until very recently, the vast majority of the world's population did not read or write. This indicates that reading and object recognition use brain mechanisms that undoubtedly existed long before the invention of writing. However, just as experience seeing faces affects the development of the fusiform face area in the right hemisphere, experience learning to read words affects the development of the neural circuitry in the visual word form area, which, probably not coincidentally, is found in the fusiform cortex of the left hemisphere. A functional imaging study by Brem and colleagues, 2010, scanned the brains of young children who had not yet learned to read. Initially, the sight of printed words activated the ventral posterior occipitotemporal region bilaterally. After 3 to 4 hours of teaching the associations of written letters and their sounds, the sight of words activated the left hemisphere. Learning to read affects the connections of the neural system involved in recognizing letters and words. The fusiform face area has the ability to quickly recognize unique configurations of people's eyes, noses, lips, and other features of their faces, even when the features of two people's faces are very similar. For example, relatives and close friends of identical twins can see at a glance which twin they are looking at. Similarly, our VW-Phe can recognize a word even if it closely resembles another one. See figure 14.31. It can also quickly recognize words written in different type styles, fonts, or cases. This means that the VW-Phe can recognize whole words with different shapes. For example, chair and chair do not look the same. It takes an experienced reader the same amount of time to read equally familiar 3-letter words and 6-letter words. Nazir et al., 1998, which means that the whole word reading process does not have to identify the letters one at a time, just as the face recognition process in the right fusiform cortex does not have to identify each feature of a face individually before the face is recognized. Instead, we recognize several letters and their locations relative to each other. The VW-Phe is critical in recognizing whole words and whole word reading, but that may not be its only function. Vogel and colleagues, 2014, suggest that the VW-Phe is potentially important in many different processing tasks, not just reading. Damage to the VW-Phe produces surface dyslexia and impaired whole word reading. A study by Gallard et al. 2006 combined fMRI and lesion evidence from a single participant and suggested that the left fusiform cortex does, indeed, contain this region. A patient with a severe seizure disorder became a candidate for surgery to remove the seizure focus. Before the surgery was performed, the patient viewed printed words and pictures of faces, houses, and tools while his brain was being scanned. He knew that the seizure focus was located in a region that played a critical role in reading, but his symptoms were so severe that he elected to undergo the surgery. As expected, the surgery produced a deficit in whole word reading. A combination of structural and functional imaging revealed that the lesion, a very small one, was located in the fusiform gyrus, the location of the VW-Phe. Plasticity in the visual word form area. What did the region of the visual association cortex that we now know as the VW-Phe do before people invented written language? What does it do in people who do not read or write? As Deheen and colleagues, 2010, note, cultural inventions such as reading and mathematics are too recent to have influenced the human genome. Therefore, they must be acquired through the recycling of neuronal networks evolved for other purposes, but whose initial properties are sufficiently similar to the target function and which possess enough plasticity, particularly during childhood, for their functionality to be partially converted to this novel task. P. 1837. The ability to co-opt brain regions for new purposes allows humans across many different cultures, with many different languages and writing systems, to learn to read and write fluently. Fluency and literacy can develop very quickly in some cases, further supporting the idea that the relevant neural pathways are present prior to development of a new language. For example, consider that at least 2 written languages were invented by specific individuals. Hangul, the written form of the Korean language, was invented by King Sejong and his scholars in the 14th century. The characters of the Hangul alphabet are designed to look like the shapes the mouth makes when they are pronounced. In the early 19th century, Sequoyah, a Cherokee living in what is now the state of North Carolina, spent 12 years developing a written version of his language. He analyzed the sounds of his language and selected 85 symbols from English and Greek letters and some additional symbols that he invented. He was not familiar with the sounds that English and Greek letters represented, so the sounds he assigned to them bore no relationship to those of the languages they came from. Within a few months of the introduction of Sequoyah's alphabet, thousands of people learned to read and write the Cherokee language. Swed and colleagues, 2009, note that the most important cues to object recognition, which is the primary task of the visual system, are those that remain relatively constant even when we view objects from different angles. The most reliable of these cues are the ways that lines meet at vertices, forming junctions with particular shapes, such as L, T, and X. Swed and his colleagues presented incomplete drawings of objects and letters that were missing their vertices, junctions or corners where lines meet, or they presented drawings of objects and letters that were missing portions of the midsegments, lines between these junctions. Figure 14.32 shows a drawing and a word with the vertices missing. Can you figure out what they are? What about in figure 14.32b? Generally, people identify these items more quickly in the second drawing that has the junctions present. Changizi and colleagues, 2006, analyzed the configurations of letters and symbols used in a large number of former and present writing systems from all over the world. They found that these characters seem to have been chosen by the cultures that invented them to match those found in objects in nature scenes, and they all involve junctions of lines. Early forms of writing used actual pictures, but the pictures became simplified and eventually turned into simple lines or intersecting lines and curves. Even complex symbols such as Chinese characters consist of intersecting brush strokes. Figure 14.33 shows a few of the ways that different types of intersections of two line segments can be transformed into letters found in various writing systems. Presumably, the region of the brain that becomes the VW through the process of learning to read originally evolved to recognize objects by learning the configuration of lines, straight and curved, and their junctions. Our ancestors invented forms of writing that use symbols that are distinguished by these characteristics, and a portion of the fusiform gyrus became recycled, as Deheen and colleagues phrased it, into the VW. Developmental dyslexias. Some children have great difficulty learning to read and never become fluent readers, even though they are intelligent. Specific language learning disorders, called developmental dyslexias, tend to occur in families, a finding that suggests a genetic, and hence biological, component. The concordance rate of developmental dyslexia in monozygotic twins ranges from 84% to 100%, and in dizygotic twins it ranges from 20% to 35%. Demonet et al., 2004. Linkage and association studies suggest that the chromosomes 3, 6, and May 15th contain genes responsible for different components of this disorder, Kong and Drana, 2011. As we saw earlier, the fact that written language is a recent invention means that natural selection is unlikely to have given us brain mechanisms whose only role is to interpret written language. Therefore, we should not expect that developmental dyslexia involves only deficits in reading. Indeed, researchers have found a variety of language deficits associated with dyslexia that do not directly involve reading. One common deficit is deficient phonological awareness. That is, people with developmental dyslexia have difficulty blending or rearranging the sounds of words that they hear. Eden and Zafiro, 1998. For example, they have difficulty recognizing that if we remove the first sound from cat, we are left with the word at. They also have difficulty distinguishing the order of sequences of sounds. Hellenius et al., 1999. Problems such as these might be expected to impair the ability to read phonetically. Children with developmental dyslexia also tend to have difficulty in writing. They make spelling errors, show poor spatial arrangements of letters, and omit letters, and their writing tends to have weak grammatical development. Habib, 2000. Developmental dyslexia is a heterogeneous and complex trait, and it likely has more than one cause. However, most studies that have closely examined the nature of the impairments seen in people with developmental dyslexia have found phonological impairments to be most common. For example, a study of 16 people with developmental dyslexia by Ramus and colleagues, 2003, found that all of the participants had phonological deficits. 10 of the people also had auditory deficits, 4 also had a motor deficit, and 2 also had a visual deficit. These deficits, especially auditory deficits, aggravated the people's difficulty in reading, but did not appear to be primarily responsible for the difficulty. 5 of the people had only phonological deficits, and these deficits were sufficient to interfere with their ability to read. Some evidence has been obtained from functional imaging studies that suggests that the brains of people with developmental dyslexia process written information differently than do the brains of proficient readers. For example, Shaywitz and colleagues, 2002, had 70 children with dyslexia and 74 children without dyslexia read words and pronounceable non-words. The researchers found significantly different patterns of brain activation in the two groups. A child's reading skill was positively correlated with activation of the left VW. Heft and colleagues 2007 found that people with dyslexia showed decreased activation in the left temporoparietal cortex, dorsal to the region identified by Shaywitz and colleagues, and in the VW. They also saw hyperactivation of the left inferior frontal cortex, including Broca's area. Presumably, the activation of Broca's area reflected an effort to decode the phonology of the incomplete information being received from the poorly functioning regions of the more posterior brain regions involved in reading. Most languages, including English, contain many irregular words. For example, consider cough, rough, bow, and through. Because there is no phonetic rule that describes how these words are to be pronounced, readers of English are obliged to memorize them. In fact, the 40 sounds that distinguish English words can be spelled in up to 1,120 different ways. In contrast, Italian is much more regular. This language contains 25 different sounds that can be spelled in only 33 combinations of letters. Helmuth, 2001. Palisu and colleagues 2001 found that developmental dyslexia is rare among people who speak Italian and is much more common among speakers of English and French, another language with many irregular words. Palisu and his colleagues identified college students with a history of dyslexia from Italy, France, and Great Britain. The Italian students with dyslexia were much harder to find, and their disorders were much less severe than those of their English-speaking and French-speaking counterparts. However, functional imaging revealed that when all three groups were asked to read, their scans all showed the same pattern of activation, a decrease in the activity of the left occipitotemporal cortex, the same general region that Shaywitz and colleagues, 2002, identified. Palisu and colleagues, 2001, concluded that the brain anomalies that cause dyslexia are similar in the three countries they studied, but that the regularity of Italian spelling made it much easier for people likely to develop dyslexia in Italy to learn to read. By the way, other dyslexia-friendly languages, such as Spanish, Finnish, Czech, and Japanese, might actually help reduce the effects of dyslexia. For example, one study cites the case of an Australian boy who lived in Japan and learned to read Japanese, but who experienced dyslexia in English, Rees, 2001. If the spelling of words in the English language were regularized, for example, friend instead of friend, night instead of night, cough instead of cough, the impact of dyslexia might be substantially reduced. Toward an understanding of writing. LO 14.13 explained the biological basis of phonological and orthographic dysgraphia. Writing depends on knowledge of the words that are to be written, along with the proper grammatical structure of the sentences they are to form. If an individual is unable to express themselves by speech, there is likely to be a writing disturbance, dysgraphia, as well. In addition, most cases of dyslexia are accompanied by dysgraphia. One type of writing disorder involves difficulties in motor control, in directing the movements of a pen or pencil to form letters and words. Investigators have reported surprisingly specific types of writing disorders that fall into this category. For example, some patients can write numbers, but not letters. Some can write uppercase letters, but not lowercase letters. Some can write consonants but not vowels, some can write in cursive but cannot print uppercase letters, and others can write letters normally but have difficulty placing them in an orderly fashion on the page. Alexander et al., 1992, Kibeli, 1991, Margolin and Goodman-Shulman, 1992, Silveri, 1996. Many regions of the brain are involved in writing. For example, damage that produces various forms of aphasia will produce impairments in writing that are similar to those seen in speech. Organization of the motor aspects of writing involves the dorsal parietal lobe and the premotor cortex. These regions and the primary motor cortex, of course, become activated when people engage in writing, and damage to these regions impairs writing. Katanoda et al., 2001, Menon and Desmond, 2001, Otsuki et al., 1999. A functional imaging study by Ridges and colleagues, 1999, had people sign their names with either their index finger or their big toe. In both cases, doing so activated the premotor cortex that controlled movements of the hand. This finding suggests that when we learn to make a complex series of movements, the relevant information is stored in regions of the motor association cortex that control the part of the body that is being used, but that this information can be used to control similar movements in other parts of the body. Longcamp and colleagues, 2005, found that simply looking at alphabetical characters activated the premotor cortex, on the left side in right-handed people and on the right side in left-handed people. See figure 14.34. A more basic type of writing disorder involves problems in the ability to spell words, as opposed to problems with making accurate movements of the fingers. Like reading, which involves phonetic and whole word processes, writing, or, more specifically, spelling, involves more than one method. Audition in writing. The first method is related to audition. When children acquire language skills, they first learn to recognize the sounds of words, then learn to say them, then learn to read, and then learn to write. Reading and writing depend heavily on the skills that are learned earlier. For example, to write most words, we must be able to sound them out in our heads, that is, to hear them and to articulate them subvocally. If you want to demonstrate this to yourself, try to write a long word such as anti-disestablishmentarianism from memory and see whether you can do it without saying the word to yourself. If you recite a poem or sing a song to yourself, even subvocally, at the same time, you will see that the writing comes to a halt. Vision in writing. A second method of writing involves transcribing an image of what a particular word looks like, copying a visual mental image. Have you ever looked off into the distance to picture a word so that you could remember how to spell it? Some people may not use phonological spelling and have to write some words down to see whether they look correct. This method involves visual memories, not acoustical ones. Memorization in writing. A third method of writing involves memorization of letter sequences. We learn these sequences the way we learn poems or the lyrics to a song. For example, many Americans learn to spell Mississippi with a sing-song chant that goes like this: MSSSSPPI, emphasizing the bold-faced letters. Similarly, many speakers of English say the alphabet with the rhythm of a children's song that is commonly used to teach it. This method involves memorizing sequences of letter names, not translating sounds into the corresponding letters. Motor memory in writing. Finally, the fourth method of writing involves motor memories. We memorize motor sequences for writing or typing very familiar words, such as our own names. Atsuki and colleagues 2002 reported the case of a man who lost the ability to type after a stroke that damaged the ventral left frontal lobe. His ability to speak and understand speech, his ability to read, and his ability to write on a physical surface were not affected, and he showed no other obvious motor impairments besides his dystypia, as the investigators named it. This case and others suggest that some regions of the left cortex are uniquely involved in the motor memory for typing. Cook et al., 2013, Higashiyama et al., 2015, Ryu et al., 2012. A second case involving stroke affecting the junction between the left parietal and occipital lobes resulted in symptoms of not only dystypia, but also dyslexia, deficits in motor memory for texting on a cell phone, Thomas and Mestre, 2017. Writing normally involves holding a stylus, for example, a pen or pencil, and moving its point across a screen, piece of paper, or other surface. But we can also create visual records by typing with a keyboard. The first three methods of writing, sounding out the letters of a word, visualizing it, or reciting a memorized sequence of letters, apply as well to typing as they do to writing. However, the movements that we make with our hands and fingers are different when we write or type. Skilled typists learn automatic sequences of movements that produce frequently used words, but these are different from the movements we would make when we write these words. Neural basis of writing. Neurological evidence supports at least the first three of these methods of writing. Brain damage can impair the first of these methods, phonetic writing. This deficit is called phonological dysgraphia, Schelice, 1981. Dysgraphia refers to a writing deficit, just as dyslexia refers to a reading deficit. People with this disorder are unable to sound out words and write them phonetically. They cannot write unfamiliar words or pronounceable non-words, such as the ones presented in the module on reading. They can, however, visually imagine familiar words and then write them. Phonological dysgraphia appears to be caused by damage to regions of the brain involved in phonological processing and articulation. Damage to Broca's area, the ventral premotor gyrus, and the insula cause this disorder, and phonological spelling tasks activate these regions. Henry et al., 2007, Omura et al., 2004. Orthographic dysgraphia is just the opposite of phonological dysgraphia. It is a disorder of visually based writing. People with orthographic dysgraphia can only sound words out. They can spell regular words such as care or tree, and they can write pronounceable nonsense words. However, they have difficulty spelling irregular words such as half or busy, Beauvois and de Ruessen, 1981. They may write half or biz. Orthographic dysgraphia, impaired phonological writing, like surface dyslexia, is caused by damage to the VW on the base of the temporal lobe. Henry et al., 2007. Both lesion and functional imaging studies implicate the posterior inferior temporal cortex in writing of irregularly spelled English words or kanji symbols. Nakamura et al., 2000, Rapsack and Beeson, 2004. This region appears to be involved not in the motor aspects of writing, but in knowledge of how irregular words are spelled or what strokes make up a kanji character. The third method of spelling depends on a person's having memorized sequences of letters that spell particular words. Cipollati and Warrington, 1996, reported the case of a patient who lacked this ability. The patient sustained a left hemisphere stroke that severely disrupted his ability to spell words orally and impaired his ability to recognize words that the examiners would spell aloud. Presumably, his ability to spell written words depended on the first two methods of writing, auditory and visual. The examiners noted that when they spelled out words to him, he would make writing movements with his hand or together his hands. When they asked him to clasp his hands together so that he could not make these writing movements, his ability to recognize four-letter words being spelled aloud dropped from 66% to 14%. It appears that he was using feedback from hand movements to recognize the words he was writing on his knee. As we saw in the module on reading, some patients, those with direct dyslexia, can read aloud without being able to understand what they are reading. Similarly, some patients can write words that are dictated to them even though they cannot understand these words. Lesser, 1990, Reltgen et al., 1986. They cannot communicate by means of writing because they cannot translate their thoughts into words. Some of these patients can even spell pronounceable non-words, which indicates that their ability to spell phonetically is intact. Reltgen and colleagues, 1986, referred to this disorder as semantic agraphia, but perhaps the term direct dysgraphia would be more appropriate because of the parallel with direct dyslexia. See figure 14.3.